All right, welcome back to Brokers of Secrets. This episode is for those of you who are building an empire or expanding an empire and wanting to know how to pass the empire on to the next generation, whether it's your heir or your team. Now, it's very simple. You may think that you're not an empire builder, that you're just going to work for a company and you're happy. If you got some retirement, you're good. But I'm going to tell you right now, you may be wasting your potential. Because if you truly understand how powerful the human mind is, you'll realize this episode is for everyone who has an above average intelligence or beyond. Now, I know this may sound like a bold statement, but you deserve to have an experience of building an empire. Now, it's not for the faint of hearts, but that's easy because if you listen to the previous episode, we'll show you that it's about designing and then resolving what you don't want in your heart and mind, and you're ready for empire building. To me, in my opinion, many of you are ready to build an empire, but it doesn't mean that it's the same conventional, like what we read in fairy tales, that kind of, or a history book, that kind of empire. What I'm saying is it could be an empire in your own right, in your own profession, in your own career, in your own whatever it is that you're passionate about, right? You could create frankly, a book and become an author, and that could become your empire because it could become a best-selling book. You could become a film director of some of the biggest films that are ever going to be produced. You could be someone who builds an empire in, different technology, AI. There's a lot of opportunities there. You could be building an empire in finance. You could be building an empire in the cleaning business. You can be building an empire in the grocery stores business. You could do anything in a very real sense. The problem becomes when there are too many people living in scarcity as they're building this or wanting to expand their empire. Then they cause problems in society. Let me break this down for you. You can act from scarcity in just about any position, no matter how rich or how poor you are, or wherever you think your wealth level is. You can act in abundance also, regardless of how much money you have or don't have. However, the intention of abundance and the intention of scarcity maybe you have the same behavior, like cutting cost or hiring someone or firing someone or bringing on a new client, doing certain marketing. You may do the same behavior, but the outcome will be vastly different. Acting out of scarcity usually lands you in scarcity situations. Acting out of abundance, I'm not going to promise you every time is going to land you abundance. However, over time, as well as more consistently, you will land yourself in abundance. Now, you may say, well, duh, that's obvious. What's not obvious is how do you tell the difference between an act that is actually based in abundance with that intention of abundance, and how do you tell what is based in scarcity? Huge difference. You could actually hire someone thinking you're acting abundantly, while in your mind, you're actually scared to do the work. So you hire someone who can do the work. And yet, because of the scarcity, you hire someone who may not be able to actually do everything you want. And it end up giving you a lot of problem, right? I remember having a client one time told me, he hired someone to solve specific problems in his business that he didn't want to deal with. Over time, that person he hired ended up being the problem he didn't want to deal with. Very interesting. It was out of scarcity. It seemed like he was doing it out of abundance. It was out of scarcity. Something very simple, but it created a lot of pain. Well, same thing when it comes to cutting costs. Can you tell the difference between cutting costs abundantly versus with scarcity? Very big difference what you would cut cost on. I'll tell you, most of the time people who cut costs out of scarcity, they're cutting costs when it comes to themselves. It's not even their team. They're cutting costs on themselves because they're like, oh, I shouldn't invest in myself. I shouldn't put money in myself into making my own life better. They drain their own battery. They drain their own energy out of what? Out of that scarcity mindset, thinking that it'll actually produce abundance. It doesn't. It happens all the time. Whether you're building an empire, expanding an empire, or trying to pass on this empire, preserving wealth, hoping that it doesn't lose the wealth or the power, the influence that you've built. If you do it with abundance, you're going to be able to keep it much longer or forever. But if you do it out of scarcity, it will eventually crumble. So really, it's important to understand the psychological structure behind abundance and scarcity and how it influences your ability to build and expand and preserve your empire. Now, how about we start here? What is abundance and what is scarcity? If you look at abundance, you may say, oh, it's an act, maybe a selfless act. Some people will say that. But the truth is, it's not about being selfless, because selfless means scarcity to self oftentimes and abundance to others. That in and of itself is actually scarcity. It presupposes that you can only have one, not the other. That's not real abundance. That's sacrifice. That's a sacrificial mindset. So the word selfless, if it describes you, if you think, oh, I'm a selfless leader, I'm all about serving others and sacrificing myself, you are already acting out of scarcity. And guess what? You may think you're exempt from it as you're listening to this. You're like, I do some, but not that big of a deal. No, it's a huge deal. It will show up also in your family life, in your romantic life, in other areas of your life. You may give up your health. You may give up your romantic relationship. You may give up the other things that you care to do. Maybe it's a hobby. Maybe it's something you're passionate about that you love to do in your personal time. You give that up for somehow wanting, because you're saying you're wanting to serve other people, you're wanting to give other people. There are a lot of people that do this. Mothers giving up their time to themselves because they're like, oh, I don't have time for myself because I got to take care of my kids, or I got to work, or both. Same thing with fathers who are doing all the work and whatever it is that they work on, or they're doing whatever it is to sacrifice. Like my father, he worked so much I never saw him. 1 year I saw him once. There was 1 year I saw him once. And he, in his mind, was acting out of abundance because he wanted to create abundance for us. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not grateful. I'm very grateful. What I am noticing is that action presupposes there was no other way. That is scarcity. I'll tell you an interesting story. I remember when my father visited me, and it was a very important event in my life. He came and visited me. First time coming to the U.S., and he came for 3 days. And I'm like, hey, if you fly all the way here, you should stay maybe a little longer. I'd love to see you longer, right? There are some events and opportunity to show you around. 3 days is not even long enough to get over the jet lag. He's like, no, I got to get back to the business. Well, he built a business, but it was not profitable. He was simply wanting to go back because he felt obligated to be there, but it was already a failing business. He started the business out of scarcity because he hated his job. And then he left after 3 days of being with me for this important event. He went back because of scarcity, not because of abundance or selfless act. He was scared. He was acting out of scarcity. And the business eventually folded not very long after. And all he could think about was regret and regretting how he only was here for 3 days at one of the most important events. Now, here's the thing. Many of you do this in different forms. You're thinking, oh, I'm going to sacrifice. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that because it's for my good or for the good of others. No. True abundance, I'm going to tell you, you take care of your health. You take care of your emotions. And by the way, emotions are signals from your subconscious wanting to communicate something important. The stronger the emotion, the stronger the signal, the more important oftentimes, not always, the more important, or the longer you've ignored it, right? Now, if you don't take care of your emotions, it's like you're not taking care of yourself because you're ignoring important messages from yourself. Some of these are warnings. Some of these are ways to help you navigate life better. So you've got to pay attention to that, right? It's part of taking care of yourself. Well, on top of it, what you do with your time, your energy, you've got to think about. If you are doing things that are draining you, you are already acting out of scarcity. Now, this may sound crazy to many of you. You're like, well, don't you have to do sacrifices? Don't you have to sacrifice now and do things that you don't want to do so that you can have joy later? I'm going to tell you that's a conventionally accepted so-called wisdom that is not actually true. Because we live in a quantum reality, the observer actually has a lot of influence on what actually happens in our so-called reality. So simply put, you and the rules that you have in your head is what your reality is made out of. If the rules in your head says you have to sacrifice to get what you want and you have to suffer through pain, and that's obviously not actually abundance, that's scarcity, your world will be scarcity driven. Therefore, you do those things, and you do have to do those things. You do have to abide by those rules in your head that are not actually true. They are illusions, but you live by this illusion. This imaginary world that you live in is literally made out of the rules that you set in your mind. Now, you may say, well, isn't there an objective reality? You tell me. How do you even know what that is, right? Enough people agree on it? Here's the thing. Enough people are living in scarcity, so of course they're going to agree with you. So be very mindful that at different points in your journey, whether you're building an empire, expanding an empire, or passing on the empire, if you're acting out of scarcity, the chances of you being able to preserve your wealth is very minimal. You may say, well, but what about those people who sacrificed their whole life, built something amazing, pass it on, and it became amazing? You hear the stories of these heroes and these empire builders or these massively successful families that have done it. Here's the thing. There was one point in time they switched from scarcity to abundance. And I'm going to tell you, many super wealthy people are living in scarcity, so their wealth and their empire does not last. Think about how many empires fell. And it's not about having the right finance, manager or financial advisor or team or even the right family office. Oftentimes, of course, you got to have those. Oftentimes is a crumbling down of their psychological structure because they're acting out of scarcity their whole life. Now, you may say, hey, look, I don't have trillions of dollars or billions of dollars or even hundreds of millions or even tens of millions to manage. I don't think about that right now, but you should. Because if you can't even act abundantly now, money is just a magnifier, and wealth is just a magnifier, and free time is just a magnifier. So if you cannot do abundance in your mind with a small amount, which may sound counterintuitive, you can't necessarily do the same. You can't necessarily have abundance even though you have more. And frankly, you likely won't get to more if you're living in scarcity. There was one point in time for people who have built massive empires to shift from scarcity to abundance. It's different for those who just got wealth passed on to them because their neurology was never trained to experience abundance. They may live in wealth, but they don't experience wealth. So how do you make sure that you pass it on to heirs or next generation who are abundance-driven? Well, abundance-driven, you need to train them. You need to train them on abundance. This is a psychological structure they need to be trained on. It's not just out of nowhere they were born with it, right? Many of them were not born with it. They may even be exposed their whole life to it and be familiar with it, but they may not know how it works. So it's important to understand that if you act out of scarcity, you can do the same action, yet it could produce scarcity-driven outcome. I hope that's simple enough to understand. This is a topic that actually is probably one of the most important for you to understand. Yet, Most people think, for example, I was talking to a business owner one time. He's like, I'm going to cut costs on my business. And I'm doing this because I think that that's what's going to bring me more abundance. Now, there's nothing wrong with cutting cost. However, is cutting costs the same as being abundance? It's not if it's driven by scarcity. So I asked a few questions. We dug deeper. And he said, well, I'm scared that I'm scared. That alone tells me he's acting out of scarcity. So he went on, he said, I'm scared that the bills are too high, and if I don't cut cost, I won't be able to afford it. He's presupposing in his mind that he doesn't have enough money to pay for it anyway already, right? So he's cutting cost. Of course, he could be cutting costs and it's smart. And I'm not saying don't cut costs if you're scared. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is sometimes being scared is your mind communicating certain things need to change. And it's not just cutting cost. It's something else. It's removing certain blockages, or it's removing a certain behavior or habit, or installing a new behavior based on abundance. Now, you may say, well, what about hiring? Because one time there was a lady that came to me and she's like, I'm hiring a new team and they're going to be able to solve problems for me and free up my time. Well, here's the thing. The deeper question is that going to work? It's not that it's going to work or not. The deeper question is it based on scarcity or is it based on abundance? Because if she is building her team, hiring her team because she is doing it out of scarcity, then it will lead to more problems later on. So I asked deeper questions. And she said, well, there are customers I don't want to deal with face-to-face or on the call because I simply just don't like that aspect of the business. So I want someone to deal with them because they're too high maintenance. I'm thinking in my mind, well, that sounds like the customers is the issue, not that she should hire more people necessarily, right? Think about this. She said her clients are too high maintenance. She doesn't want to deal with them, but she's the owner, right? I'm not saying the owner has to deal with them, but if she's attracting that kind of clients, then there perhaps needs to be a different design, right? Or that she needs to be compensated really well enough to justify it, right? But based on how she was telling me that story or her experience, hiring someone was just putting a Band-Aid on it. So there's a middleman between her and her clients. I said, no, that's not the solution. You can hire people to work with people you want to work with. That's very different. That's acting out of abundance. In her life, she's presupposing that she has to work with people she doesn't want to work with, that she doesn't like. So she has to protect herself by hiring people, paying more. She had plenty of free time to work with her clients, but she simply didn't want to. It wasn't like she was working with 100 clients. She actually had the time and energy. And then I asked her the important question. I'm like, what if you like all your clients? Would you hire? She said, no, because I would enjoy working with them. See, that's the issue. Because she hired these people to work with people she doesn't want to work with. These middlemen that she hires are still going to bring the problems to her being the decision maker. It's not like it's going to just disappear. The problems are still there. So this was an act of scarcity, very clear from the beginning, and it will lead to problems down the road. Same thing when it comes to relationships. How many people date or marry out of scarcity versus out of abundance? How many people do exercises on January 1st, go on a diet out of scarcity versus out of abundance? Are they really going after that goal that they have on their vision board, or are they simply tired of what they see in their mirror? Now, nothing wrong with motivation coming from pain. Again, is a signal from their mind saying, hey, you should change probably. But it will not be sustained by pain. It shouldn't be. It's not healthy. Not only that, if you go far enough away from pain, this motivation disappears. So let me break down what I'm telling you in this episode. Whether you're building an empire, maybe the empire is growing, or you're starting an empire. Maybe it's a startup. Maybe it's a new company, new concept you're working on, fundraising, acquiring new customers. Or you've already done both. You sold your company and you're now financially completely free, and you're just wanting to train your kids or your heirs or whoever that'll take over to be able to actually take over with an abundant mindset that will actually expand it and preserve it, right? Regardless of which phase you're in, if you're acting out of scarcity, which most of you don't even know the difference, it requires you to understand the mental structure, the psychological structure behind scarcity and abundance, the mental programs that we talked about in previous episodes that tells you what is actually going on, the beliefs, the identity piece, like what are you doing behind this act? What is the real intention? If you know how to decode this and understand the mental programs, the psychological structures, and by the way, just understanding it may not be good enough. Like the previous episode, we encourage you to actually master this, because I don't know if there's anything else more important, because this world is mental in terms of it's built by mental structures. If your mental structure is based on scarcity, it will crumble. It will cause problems in the long run. It will not stand on its own. So you need to examine, you need to understand and become masterful at understanding, decoding, and resolving the issues. So here's how you can look at this. This is one of the easiest, simplest way to understand this. Let's say there's a baseline of pain that you want to avoid. And most people will go to avoid their pain. They'll do whatever it takes to avoid pain, right? They'll want to leave that baseline and go as far as possible. But it will come a point where they get so far, they no longer feel motivated. If they're driven by scarcity or away from scarcity, they'll go so far away, they no longer feel motivated now. They will find a way to create scarcity. And then they will go sometimes even beyond that baseline, meaning they will create extreme levels of pain in their lives, just so that they could become motivated again. And many business owners will crash their business just to do that, or crash their relationships just to do that. They'll crumble their empires just so that they can rebuild it again. That is scarcity. So you may act abundant. You may look like you're the man or the woman in charge. You may look like you're doing great. And you may even look like you're really strong, resilient. Problem is, you're basing your entire life on scarcity and pain, away from pain, running away from scarcity, right? Which causes this loop that we've been talking about. The ideal scenario, psychologically, the ideal structure for actually building, sustaining, growing, and preserving wealth is actually build it based on pleasure and abundance and joy and health, happiness, gratitude, all of the wonderful things. You won't need motivation. It will naturally pull you towards it. You must design a life that way and understand that any time you take action, you need to examine, am I doing it out of scarcity or am I doing it out of abundance? From big decisions to medium and even small decisions you make, ask that question. Be honest with yourself. Have an accountability partner. Have a network of people that understand what is abundance and what is scarcity and question you about it genuinely. As you understand what is driven by pain, away from pain, right? Or away from scarcity, and what is actually pleasure, joy, and abundance, if you make decisions out of this place, your resonance will be different. You will find yourself naturally experiencing more and more and more abundance with no cap, no ceiling, no limit. Again, remember, the most important thing is that build your empire, expand your empire, and preserve your empire based on abundance. We'll see you in the next episode.